So what I'm going to present today is a long-term online experiment that has the aim of testing the effect of a collective risk on the evolution of social norms and its impact on cooperation under collective risk. So this work has been done in collaboration with a great team: Aaron Sekei, Francesca Lipari, Alberto Antonioni, Mario Paolucci, Ancio Sanchez, and Luca Tumolini. So many contemporary and social environmental problems, such as climate change and the COVID-19 pandemics, are characterized by the risk of a collective disaster. In these situations, collective and individual action is required, for example, in order to reduce carbon footprint and avoid the risk of dangerous climate change. The same applies to the COVID-19 pandemics, where individual and collective efforts are required in order to avoid the uncontrolled spread of the virus. These situations are also characterized by the fact that they pose major collective action problems, that are situations in which there is, for the group, there is a benefit to have a social outcome, such as that of reducing carbon footprint, but individuals have no incentives to act alone. So the question then is to understand how is it possible to reduce the tension between the interest of the individuals and the interest of the group, in order to allow individuals to cooperate. Some solutions can be taken through formal institutions like laws and treaties, but the large scale and fast development of these situations sometimes make these formal institutions inefficient or difficult to enforce or too costly. And is when informal institutions such as social norms become essential. So social norms are a key concept in the social sciences. They have been referred to as the grammar, the cement, or the glue of society. They may regulate almost every aspect of our everyday life, from the fact that we leave tips in restaurants, even when we are not formally required to do that, but also the amount to tip, 5, 10, 15%. They also regulate the way in which we talk each other by listening before reacting, and also the way in which we greet each other by saying hello, shaking hands, by kissing 1, 2, 3 times, starting from the right or from the left, or with a touch of the elbow. It is becoming more and more frequent during this pandemic to reduce the spread of the virus. I think it's worth mentioning that social norm can make stable any type of behavior, not just socially desirable behavior, such as cooperation, but also socially undesirable behavior, like corrupt behavior, but also behavior against minorities, or honor norms that are still quite widespread in many parts of the world. Despite the scientific and practical importance of social norms, the empirical foundations is still limited. And I think there are multiple reasons why this is the case, but one can be attributed that until recently, there were no clear and testable definition of social norms. And this made it difficult to understand the feedbacks between the social norms and the behavior. In this work, I will rely on a definition of social norms that has been provided by Bicchieri, that I think that has the advantage of being clear and operational, as we will see later. So social norms can be then defined as informal and shared behavioral rules that, unlike legal norms, are not codified, that prescribe what individuals ought or are not to do, and they are complied with because of social expectations and potentially social sanctions. So compliance with social norms is not unconditional like for moral norm, it is conditional to have the right type of expectations. And these expectations can be broken into empirical expectations and normative expectations. The first ones are people's beliefs about what others will do. The normative expectations are people's beliefs about what others think that one ought to do. So empirical expectations describe the social world, while normative expectations provide the prescriptive normative component. In these perspectives, social norms are not just a behavior, are not just expectations, is a combination of the two. This definition of social norm has the advantage of dissecting this aggregate concept into the underlying expectations. And on this account, social norms can be said to exist if we observe the behavior and the corresponding expectations, and they can be said to cause the behavior if people respond to both empirical and normative expectations. So, building on this definition of social norms, what we wanted to test and understand in this work is the effect of a collective risk in changing the strength of social norms, and also in promoting social coordination in a collective risk situation. So the idea that collective risk affects the strength of social norms is not a new one, is well known, and it has received a lot of attention. For example, the tightness and looseness theory of culture by Michel Gelfand posits that societies that experience high threats, such as ecological threats or man-made threats, develop tight cultures with strong norms, promoting social coordination for organizing social life. These and also similar other theories of the ecological theory of culture received many different types of support. But they were mainly correlational. So what we wanted to do in this work is to provide causal evidence of the effect of a collective risk on the strength of norms and on cooperative behavior in collective action problems. And we have done that to an online long-term experiment. So we conducted a 30-day experiment with 300 subjects from June to September 2018, in which subjects had the possibility of taking their daily decisions using their mobiles or their laptops, so they don't have to go in the lab. This long-term frame allowed social norms to evolve and crystallize. The fact that it was not conducted in the lab but outside also allowed the subjects to decide in situ and not in the abstract environment, but also to have access to a more diverse population. So subjects that were not, that couldn't have the possibility of reach the lab at that specific time of the day, had the possibility of participating with us in this experiment. And again, the question that we wanted to understand is, do changes in collective threats affect the strength of social norms and increase cooperation? The game that our subjects faced daily was a collective risk social dilemma game. So it was a modified version of the game that was designed by Milinski in 2008. It's an n-person cooperation problem where we had more than 2 people. Players were placed in groups of 6, and these groups were reshuffled every day. Subjects didn't have the possibility to interact or to know the identity of the other subjects. Every day, each player is given 100 tokens. They independently decide how many tokens to put in a public pot, from 0 to 100. They know that if the pot reaches a threshold of 300, they are protected from a disaster that has a known probability P of occurring, and they keep whatever they did not put in the pot. If the threshold is not reached, players lose all tokens with a probability P. The Nash equilibrium is given by the probability of the disaster to occur. When it is below 0.5, the only Nash equilibrium is that of contributing 0. Above 0.5, there are two different equilibria, that of contributing at the threshold level or contributing 0. Let me give you an example of the task that our subjects has to face every day. So they receive 100 tokens, there are 6. They have to decide how much to put in the collective pot. In this case, they put 310 tokens. That was more than 300, that was the threshold. So the catastrophe in this case was avoided. In the second example, again, 6 subjects, 100 tokens. They have to decide how much to put in the pot. They put 290 tokens, so it's less than 300, that is the threshold. If there is a probability of the disaster to occur that is set at 0.6, then if the disaster does not occur, players keep for themselves what they did not put in the collective pot. But if the disaster does occur, everyone loses everything. That was the decision they had to take daily. We have 4 treatments. We have the within subjects treatments change the risk probability from high to low. High was 0.9 probability of the disaster to occur, and low was 0.6. So for 14 days, our subjects played with a high risk of, with a high probability of the risk to occur, 0.9, and after 14 days, this probability changed to 0.6. This treatment was aimed to test the effect of a change in risk on the strength of social norms. The second treatment is a between subjects treatment in which we varied the ordering, whether the high risk was first or after. And this was aimed to test whether there were some spillover effects. Then we had 4 hypotheses that we wanted to test. The first one is that cooperation is related to individuals' empirical and normative expectations. So we wanted to test whether in this setting there were social norms. The second hypothesis was aimed to test the causal effect of social norms on behavior. So whether by manipulating the expectations, we could observe a change in cooperation. So the first one was an hypothesis about the existence of norms. The second one about the causal effect of social norms on the behavior that we observe. The third hypothesis was about punishment. Punishment was not a necessary condition in the definition of social norms that I presented before, but still we wanted also to test that subject punished those that considered as norm violations. And in a minute, I will show you the way in which we also implemented punishment in this experiment. And the fourth hypothesis is aimed to test the effect of risk on the strength of norms and on cooperation. So we expect stronger norms and greater cooperation when the collective risk is higher. And then we also expect slower behavioral change after a change in risk when social norms are stronger. So these are the 4 hypotheses that we tested with this experiment. So the social norm strength is, so we have computed the social norm strength in the following way, considering these 3 criteria: consistency, that is how much agreement there is among the empirical and normative expectations of subjects; accuracy, whether those expectations were accurate or not in predicting the personal normative expectation and the behavior of others; and also specificity, whether those expectations are narrow or broad. So how specific are these norms concerning the range of acceptable behavior? So strong norms then are highly consistent, highly accurate, and impinge on a specific behavior. Okay, some more details about the type of decisions that our subjects had to take. So every day, subjects had to take the following decision. They receive 100 tokens, how much will you contribute? Then either before or after the contribution choice, then also to respond to a set of questions aimed to measure norms. So the first one was about personal normative beliefs. These were taken by Bicchieri and colleagues. So it's a toolkit that was created by them to measure norms. So they had to answer the following question. In your opinion, how much should each person in your group contribute? This is to have information about their personal normative beliefs. Then again, every day, either before or after their choice in a random order, they are also to answer questions about their empirical expectations. So how much did the other 5 people in your group contribute? And have to enter their responses in this page. Please remember that groups change every day. And the responses to these questions were incentivized to the empirical expectation. So the closer their guess to the behavior of others, of the other 5 group members, the more they had been paid. So we also had every single day questions about normative expectations. How much do the other 5 people in your group think that you should each contribute? So they have to guess their responses to the personal normative beliefs. And again, if their guesses are accurate, they get extra money. So not every day, but every 4 days, they have also to answer the following questions about conditional contributions. So these are aimed to test the causal effect of social expectations on contributions. So how much will you contribute if most of the other people in your group contribute at least 50 points and think that you should each contribute at least 50 points? This is a situation in which both empirical and normative expectations are low. Contribute at least 50 points and think that you should each contribute less than 50 points. In this case, in the first case, both of them are high. In the second case, the empirical expectations are high and the normative expectations are low. Contribute less than 50 points and think that you should each contribute at least 50 points. In this case, the empirical expectations are low and the normative expectations are high. And in the last case, both of them are low. And they had to enter their decision based on those expectations. Then the very last day, we also created couples and we provided them with extra endowment, and we asked how many points did you deduct from the person you are matched with if he or she contributed less than 50 points, 50 points, or more than 50 points. And then we also asked expectations about that. Feedback. Every day they receive the following feedback. So they receive information about the contribution level of the other 5 group members. They also receive information whether the amount of money that is collected was enough to reach the threshold or not, and if the catastrophe occurred or not. The very first day before starting the game, we also collected a bunch of psychological measures, the Big 5, the social value orientation, risk preferences, the Otis spectrum quotient. And this information allows us to identify individual level predictors for norm adoption, norm compliance, and norm breaking. This is just an overview of the structure of the game from day 1 to day 30. We have pre-registered the design, the hypothesis, and the analysis. Let's move now to the results. So, hypothesis 1. We expected social norms to be present in a collective risk dilemma. So we expected that cooperation is related to the individual's empirical and normative expectations. And we found support for this hypothesis because we found that empirical and normative expectations were strongly associated with the contribution level that we observed. And this is true in a simple model in which we just had the empirical and the normative expectations, but also in the other models in which we included other controls. I think it's worth mentioning that also personal beliefs had a strong effect on contributions, and among the psychological variables, the ones that had a positive effect were being female and being prosocial, while risk preferences were not predictive of the contribution in this setting. And I think this is interesting given the type of game that our subjects faced. So this was evidence, so we found evidence that social norms were present in our setting. But just saying that social norms were there is not enough to say that social norms are causing the cooperation behavior that we are observing. So our second hypothesis, so we expect cooperation to change based on a manipulation in empirical and normative expectations. So what we did here, we tested whether a change in normative and empirical expectations compared to situations in which we have both low empirical and low normative expectations leads to a change in conditional contributions, to an increase in conditional contributions. And from here we can see that in the situations in which we have low normative expectations and high empirical expectations, there is an increase in conditional contributions compared to a setting in which both of them are low. And if the empirical expectations are low, and in this case are the normative expectations to be high, we observe even a higher increase in conditional contribution. And as expected, when both of them are high, this has the highest effect. So empirical and normative expectations had an effect in causing the contributions that we observe. And I think that also what is interesting here is that a belief like the normative expectations that have no material implications for our subjects had such a high impact on their decision to contribute or not. In order to understand why subjects were contributing, we also decided to conduct an analysis and to identify some types. So, as in line with previous research, we observed that there were conditional cooperators, so subjects that cooperated when others were cooperating. But what we wanted to understand with this analysis is what were the expectations that were driven the behavior, the conditional cooperation that we were observing. So we were able to identify 3 different behavioral types that were behind conditional cooperators, that are what we call empirical cooperators, that are subjects that were reacting on empirical expectations, normative cooperators that were subjects that were reacting to normative expectations to increase their cooperation when someone else was cooperating, and social norm followers that were reacting to both empirical and normative expectations. We also identified subjects that were unconditional, so they were not changing their behavior based on their expectations, and also another type that we call threshold-driven type, that was affected by the empirical expectations, but instead of increasing contribution, they were decreasing their contribution. So expecting that others are going or did contribute led them to contribute less. Then the third hypothesis was about enforcement. And what we observe here is that punishment, that is, the action is the one in red, is targeted mainly towards those that contributed less than 50, that is a violation of the norm. And also this is what they expected. Again, this is another piece of evidence that combined with what I showed before with hypothesis 1, provides evidence to the fact that social norms were present in this setting. Then our last hypothesis is hypothesis 4. So what we expected here is that when in risky environments to observe social norms with high strength. Okay, the blue line is the line showing the social norm strength in the high to low treatment, so when moving from 0.9 to 0.8, while the red line is the line representing the treatment going from low to high, from 0.6 to 0.9. And what we can see here is that the strength of social norms is higher, is significantly higher in those treatments, in those contexts in which the risk, the probability of the catastrophe to occur was higher. So for the blue line in the panel on the left, for the red line on the panel on the right. And this is support for the fact that a risk leads to a change in the strength of social norms. Then the second part of our hypothesis was that high risk lead to higher norm strength and also to higher contribution. And what we may observe here is that the high strength in social norms that we observed in the slide before also results in a high level of contribution. So above, we can see average contribution, and we can see that in those treatments in which the risk was higher is also where we observe that the average cooperation is the highest. And below, we can see that also the proportion of groups that were able to reach the threshold is significantly higher in those settings in which the risk was higher. So risk had an effect on the strength of norms, risk had an effect also on cooperation. The second part of hypothesis 4 was about the inertial effect of social norms. So we expected a slower behavioral change after a change in risk when social norms are stronger. So as we have seen before, social norms are stronger in the high risk scenarios. So we expect that when we move from the high to low treatment, the change in behavior is lower than when we move from the low to high treatment. So from the 0.6 to the 0.9 risk of the catastrophe to occur. So the way in which we measure that, we observe average contributions at around 15 for both treatments. We compare that with average contributions around 14 of the opposite treatment, that was the treatment in which they faced the exact same level of risk. And we use that as a baseline to see the evolution from round 15 to round 28 of the average contribution. And we observe that when moving from high to low risk, the change in behavior is significantly lower than the other way around. Let me also discuss a result that can be observed in the graph below. So when moving from another, I think, result to be discussed is that it makes a difference whether the high risk setting comes first or after. So the ordering matters, because in the high risk setting, when it comes before, there is a high level of contribution, and also the proportion of groups reaching the threshold is high. If we observe above, the average contribution when the risk is high after the low risk is comparable. But if we look below, the proportion of groups that were able to reach the threshold is significantly lower. So this means that if you start with high norm, then you are able to reach a very high level of contribution. But if you come from a low risk setting and then you move to a high risk setting, the level of contribution that you reach is not comparable. It's not comparable, and in particular is not comparable than the proportion of groups reaching the threshold. And this results in a difference in payoffs, because for the low risk treatments, there is no difference, significant difference. But if we compare the high risk scenario first or after, we can see there is a significant difference in payoffs. Because when high risk comes after, subjects start to contribute more, but not enough to reach the threshold. So it's the worst case scenario, because then they lose a lot of money. Okay, a summary of the results. Then collective threat causes the evolution of tight norms. Higher threat makes people more cooperative, and stronger norms make behavior more resistant to change. So those are the three main results that we have achieved with this experiment. So some conclusions. Large-scale cooperation then is needed to reduce collective risk, like those posed by climate change and pandemics. Social norms emerge and sustain cooperations in situations of collective risk, and the level of risk influences the strength of norms. So we observe that social expectations, both empirical and normative, are a strong driver of cooperation, stronger than personal dispositions. And I think that this result is also important for policy implications, because if you want to change behavior in these type of settings, then it's worth acting on social factors instead of individual factors in individual dispositions. And it has also been shown in the past from other work that is also easier, and it takes less time, of course, to change expectations than to change individual preferences, for example. Then, when risk of a future threat decreases, the strength of social norms may diminish as well. This is also another result that we observed before. And this is again important, because when a certain risk, when a catastrophe at a certain point is somehow averted, is solved, then there is the risk that the strength of social norms starts declining. And this may have an effect then, a feedback on the behavior. So it's important also to keep in mind this possibility, because then once a certain collective risk action problem has been temporarily solved, it's important to start implementing some measures to enforce the behavior and to keep the behavior stable. Then I think it's also important that to be aware that there are individual differences in the way people react to social expectations. And again, this could be important for policy purposes, because as we have seen before, if you provide both empirical and normative messages, these have always a positive effect on behavior, while providing empirical information had a detrimental effect on a subpart of the population. So also this result may be important for policy purposes. And that's all. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. That was a fantastic explanation of a very elegant study design. So fantastic. I think just to remind everybody, if people want to ask questions, then please post your questions in the Q&A box. Don't post them in the chat. We've already had a few questions come in, and what I would like to do is start with some of the kind of more clarification questions.
Sorry, Giulia, could you stop sharing the screen?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with some issues of clarification. So can you remind us again, so what, how is the risk instantiated in these experiments? And the first question related to that, I'll say, is did participants know the risk schedule? And did they know it was going to stay the same for a while?
Okay, thanks a lot for these two questions. So how is risk instantiated? It is instantiated in the following way. So they are told that they have to put money, tokens, in a pot, in a collective pot, and there is a certain threshold that has been set to 300. If the threshold is not reached, there is a certain probability that all the money would disappear. That is the way in which the risk was implemented. And they knew since the beginning that they would have faced 14 days with a certain risk probability, and then there would have been a change. So they know everything.
Right, okay. Then another couple of clarification points. So did the points accumulate across days, and did the participants receive a real world payoff?
Good question. Yes. So they so they did not accumulate. So they only know the payoffs that they achieved in that specific round. And then at the end of the experiment, those tokens were converted in real money. And we also had a lottery. So I don't remember, I think that were 4 subjects whose decisions and so whose payoff was doubled 10 times. And so they got a big payment. This was a way for incentivizing the behavior of our subjects, because for us was also a bet that of having such a long-term experiment. So having subjects engaged for 30 consecutive days. So we also were somehow concerned about the dropout rate, that, by the way, I didn't mention was very, very low. And so we were also positively surprised by the fact that they were engaged and they stayed until the end.
Was there a particular kind of real world system that you thought this this experimental setup was a kind of a good example of, or a kind of a model of?
So we base our design on the work by Milinski that was aimed to somehow represent the climate change situation, but with all the limitations, of course, because we had subjects facing this risk of a catastrophe every single day, and this is not what happens in reality, and also, of course, was a simplification. But I think that it may capture these, in an abstract way, these collective risk action problems.
Very good. I guess another kind of somewhat of a clarification question, but starts getting into some more theoretical areas about the cultural background of the subjects. And this is relating to the issue that's kind of becoming more prevalent now, is this, weird subjects, so Western rich country subjects. And so what's the cultural background of your studies, and do you think these things would apply elsewhere?
Yeah, good point. So they were from Spain, because we recruited those subjects, these 300 subjects, to the Ibsen subject pool. That is a big subject pool that has been built in Spain by Ancho Sanchez as a PI of this European project, with also the help, of course, of other scholars. So they were from Spain. And I think that it would be important in the future to test whether there are other factors that may affect the impact of risk on the strength of norms that can be cultural factors. So I think that it would be interesting in the future to test whether people from different cultures with different, for example, tightness levels may react to threats in different ways. And so if people from these cultures would react in their strength of norms differently depending on the starting level of tightness. So yes, I think that it would be worth to replicate this study also in other cultures. And I expect that there may be some differences.
Yeah, fantastic. So we've got another question here that's wondering if there's a difference between perceived threat and experienced risk. For example, in the low-high risk treatment, do individuals change their behavior only after experiencing disaster, or do they change immediately upon being told that the risk is higher?
Good point. So yes, so perceived risk and experienced risk. It's true that so the perceived risk is somehow only the very first day, right? Because then they always experience, not always, because it depends whether they were able to reach the threshold or not. But once they, so in our 30-day experiment, there were, I think, several occasions for them to experience the risk. So I think that, so it's true that perception of risk and experience of risk may be different, but I think that our subjects had enough time and opportunities also to experience the risk.
Have you considered other experimental designs, maybe where there's a kind of a switch, more regular switches between things, or things are a bit more chaotic? And you know, there's obviously a whole bunch of different ways that you can take these things, but
yeah, so yeah, there are, I think, many different directions that can be taken, but also that of reducing the risk. Now it's always above 0.5. So because it's, the low is 0.6, the high is 0.9. Would be interesting to see what happens if you have a risk that is at less than 0.5, because this may lead to the emergence of harmful norms, meaning norms that trap subjects in non-contributing, right? So this could be something that can be tested. I think that can also be interesting to test what happens if you have fixed groups, because now we have these groups that change every day. It was also a way of testing the emergence and change of social norms in a very extreme context. It's a context in which they don't know each other, and yeah, it's so it would be interesting to see what happens if groups stay constant, and also maybe what happens if and maybe this can relate to what I was asked before. So we can also have settings in which subjects face a low risk, then they go to high risk, and then to low risk again. And these can maybe show also different dynamics in the resistance of norms.
Just in your answer, you touched upon a point that's relevant to one of these questions, which is about whether subjects were able to communicate with each other. So presumably not, right?
No, yeah. So they were not able to communicate. Again, this was an online experiment, so they don't even see each other because they were not in the same room. They don't have any possibility of communicating. And so the situation was, I think, quite extreme for testing the emergence of social norms, because no communication, and groups were reshuffled every day. So it's yeah, it was somehow an extreme condition for testing the emergence of social norms. Yeah, but so they were not allowed to communicate.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of brings us on to some points that are being raised in the Q&A around, I guess, the differences between this experimental setup and the real world setup. So we've got a couple of questions. So one that's asking, so a general issue with these sort of experiments is individual identification with group norms. So this is going to be small in these kind of experiments, whereas probably, you know, it's stronger in the real world. So there's how does that affect things? So the particular point is that to the extent that responses to defection from norms can become an identity threat that is conflated with threat to individual survival. And then there are other related questions. How would you see your findings in the context of cultural theory of risk? In particular, would you see the relationship between norm strength and cultural risk perception? So again, in non-experimental settings, perceptions of the capriciousness of risk are culturally mediated.
Yeah, right. So for this last point, I think that again, it's worth having. I think it's a point that we didn't address, and it's difficult to address with our experiment. And I think the negation of culture on the effect of risk on the strength of norms is something that is worth exploring further in the future. Possibly either with replication of a similar study in different cultures that we may know have a different tightness level, for example, but also not just with experiments like this, but also with surveys can be done. So on this point, I think that it's really can be seen as a limitation of this work, but I think can be a future extension of it. So it's something that can be tested in the future, but I cannot say that with this data we can say something about it. Then identity, again, in this, I think that in this specific context, was very difficult for subjects to identify with the group because they change group every day. So that I think that if we found some results here in a very extreme condition, if we add group identity, I think that this would add, as another condition, for example, as another manipulation, we may observe even stronger results. But yeah, so this was really a situation in which they didn't know each other, they couldn't communicate, and they were regrouped every day. So the social identity part was really something that we couldn't test with this, but I think that it's something that can be added in future treatments.
I'll come back to the Q&A session in a minute, but I see Sergey has got his hand up, so we can have a live question from Sergey.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, Giulia. I have, I think, 2 questions about your clustering procedure and results and interpretation. Am I right that the data that you used for clustering were different from the actual behavior of subjects during the 30 days period? And I mean, and what would be kind of appropriate interpretation of this relevance? And the second one, yeah, you said, and you showed the graph with 6 clusters using, I believe, a principal component analysis. But kind of when you look at this data spread, it's, I know we're colored differently, but there are no obvious gaps. So I think the second question is, how really justifiable, how solid claims about distinct behavioral types in these experiments and actually in similar previous publications? Yeah. Thank you.
Good point. Thanks a lot. So for the first question, thanks for asking this question. So I should have mentioned that the data that we have used for the clustering is the data from the conditional contribution decisions. So those decisions that subjects had to take every 4 days, in which we manipulated empirical and normative expectations, and then we asked subjects to decide based on these expectations. So we're not the data that we observed during the experiment, but in these specific days. So this is an important clarification. Types. I think you are right. We also tried with somehow relaxing a little bit the way in which we classified those subjects, especially the social norm, what we call the social norm type. And we found that by relaxing the fact that they shouldn't just they shouldn't react both to normative and empirical expectations, but was enough that their contribution level increased based on their normative expectations, we found that 77% of our subjects could be put under this category. So I think that you are right, maybe those types were maybe too stringent, and also I think that also this classification, not just ours, can be a little bit arbitrary, but I think that it captures something that is important, the fact that subjects were reacting in some way to empirical and normative expectations, so to social factors. But then I think that being too strict and too stringent doesn't provide a good description of reality.
Can I just follow up on that? So how big were the groups, and were these behavioral types well mixed within the groups?
They were not, so the groups were groups of 6 again. And those behavioral types were extracted by computing all the results from those conditional correlation questions. So we had 300 subjects, 150 and 150, and those types were extracted from all the different subjects. And so they, again, I think that I had numbers. So using the stringent classification that I think, so that at a certain point we also we relaxed, the unconditional subjects were the 37%. Then the threshold driven, so that are those that react to empirical expectations by decreasing their level of contribution, were 26. So more or less these two groups combined were about 50–55%, and the other 45% were subjects that were reacting in a positive way to empirical expectations. So this was more or less the distribution of types among subjects.
I just asked because I was wondering if there could be some interesting, group level effects, right? You get certain mixes of behavioral types, you'll get kind of different, and that, that's probably going to explain some of the variation or the the noise in the data rather than the overall patterns, but could be something interesting to explore. There's been a couple of questions that have kind of come up, prompted by those discussions. So again, a one point of clarification is around punishment. So was the question regarding punishment presented only at the end of the study? And so punishment wasn't present throughout the study? This is kind of this is just a question without a kind of a consequence.
So punishment was not present during the study. We decided on purpose to study the emergence of social norms in the lack of peer punishment. So we really wanted to test the effect of risk on the strength of norms, not risk plus punishment. So that's why we decided not to have peer punishment or third-party punishment during the 28 days, but only the very last day. So certainly, so that's why I think was also somehow an ancillary result, because we provide evidence for the existence of social norms by showing the association between expectations and behavior. And we also put that extra piece of evidence about punishment as an additional information. But this work was not aimed to study punishment, the dynamics of punishment, because we didn't want to somehow pollute the result on the strength of norms by mixing risk and peer punishment. So it's not ideal to have punishment at the very end. It's not ideal to have it in this way, but somehow provide an extra piece of information.
And another question that's stemmed from that discussion is, so what was the percentage of threshold-driven participants? Is it a danger that empirical norms backfire? Are there many subjects that downregulate contributions when expecting others to increase?
Yeah. Very good question. So the percentage of threshold-driven were 26%. And I think that this is important because providing empirical empirical information may backfire on a big group, meaning that they use this information strategically instead of for increasing, for decreasing. So, and this is important for policy purposes because when you combine, at least in our setting, when you combine empirical and normative information, there was no evidence of such a backfire effect, while we found evidence of these with these threshold-driven subjects when you only provide empirical information. So maybe less risky to provide a combination of the two instead of just the empirical information, because there is less risk that threshold-driven subjects would react negatively, let's say, to this information.
Very good. So another question here is about another potential avenue to explore. So Leslie's asking, have you thought of introducing unfairness into future experiments, potentially asking subjects to do tasks in order to earn the tokens. Some would have to do harder tasks, and what kind of effect might that have?
Yeah. Again, this is interesting. We have another paper with a different team that is now under review exactly on this. So we didn't test so we tested the emergence of different types of norms in different fair and unfair conditions. And these affected the emergence and evolution of norms in the scenarios. So yes, I think it's so not in this setting, but we tested in a volunteering dilemma situation, and we observed the emergence of different type of norms depending on the type of task that subjects had to face, whether it was a task that was perceived as fair or as less fair. So yes, I think that. Yeah.
I would expect or predict that compliance with cooperation would go down with inequality or unfairness. Sure. Is that? Yeah,
exactly. So when when unfairness is perceived and unfairness norms emerge, then compliance decreasing accordingly. Yes,
right. So we've got a kind of a second half of one of the earlier questions, and because we're towards the end of it, it's time for kind of a broad, open-ended question. So what do you think the theoretical gaps are that your study highlights?
Yeah, I think that's so. In what so the theoretical gap that we wanted to cover here was that of really providing, I think, two things. One is a causal test of the effect of risk on the strength of norms. So this was what we wanted to test with this experiment, so providing causal evidence for that. And the second, I think, theoretical gap is providing causal evidence for the effect of social norms on cooperation in this type of settings. Again, I think that there are more and more studies now going that are really interested in understanding the empirical foundation of social norms. I think that this is the way to go. And it's important not just to show that a certain behavior is associated with norms, but to show that norms are causing the behavior that we are observing. This is important because if you want to change the behavior and you know that there are norms causing that behavior, and you know that there are certain tools to change norms by changing, for example, the expectations, then you have ways for changing the behavior. If you don't instead measure the norms and you don't assess the causal effect of those norms on behavior, then changing the behavior becomes much more difficult, right? Because you don't really know what you need to act on in order to change the behavior. So I think that the two theoretical gaps were that of testing causally the effect of risk on the strength of norms, and the second one was the causal effect of social norms on cooperative behavior in a collective risk situation. So those are the two, I think, theoretical gaps that we try to address in this, with this experiment.
If there's no other questions from the panel, I will ask my own personal question based on my own personal research interests. So I'm thinking about kind of how we can apply these things to real world situations and potentially increase the ecological validity of these studies, and trying to assess to what extent behavior in these experiments translates to real world behavior. So is that an area that you've thinking about or exploring, or any other general thoughts about such approaches?
Yeah, so the ecological validity, I think, so it's a question that we are all answering, right? So it's important. I think that at least what I'm I'm trying to do with with all the colleagues we are working together, I think is trying to use different methodologies and try to combine different type of evidence. So with this type of experiment, what we have done is to test causally the effect of risk on norms, norms on behavior. Then what you can do is to run surveys to gather, for example, information about the effect of risk on norms and how a change in risk may lead also to a change in the strength of norms. What we are now doing is to collect exactly information. Now it's somehow it's a good time for that, because the risk of a catastrophe is changing every day. So the risk of the pandemics is changing every day. So we are also measuring and trying to measure the way in which this changing risk is changing the strength of norms, administering questionnaires and surveys to people, in this case to people in Italy, but also you can start administering these questions to people all over the world. So I think that to achieve external validity for this type of studies, I think it's important to collect evidence from many sources, and we are at the very beginning. So it's I think it's a collective effort, and the community working on social norms is growing quickly, and I think it's also great that there is this open source and open data mindset that I think would help the domain and the community to develop good work, but also work that can be somehow applied to understand the real world. I think it's something that is difficult to do alone, but it's somehow a collective also, a collective task.
Okay, one final question from the Q&A and then we'll let you go. This is one of the previous questioners, just to kind of clarify the question. So what theoretical or modeling studies would you like to see based on the finding of your studies? I guess, what are the remaining gaps?
So something that I would like to see is feedbacks between risk and social norms and behavior. So I think that one of the very last points of my talk was about the fact that when the risk is diminishing, this also led the strength of social norms to diminish. So this means that there are some cycles that may arise that it's really important to study, because if the risk is averted and social norms go down, this can have the effect of having the behavior to change again, the risk to increase again. So this creates some cycles, right? And this is something, this oscillatory dynamic, it's something that I really would like to study and to better understand in the future, because it's not just that you have the effect of risk on norms, but also of norms and behavior that is sustained by those norms on risk. It's really a feedback loop that needs to be studied, and I think is a big theoretical gap that it's worth filling in the future.
I guess potentially different patterns of risk would have different effects on norm stability and things like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for an amazing presentation. Everybody's clapping silently on the, we can't open up the microphones to hear that applause, but a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks
a lot.
Sergey.
Thank you, Giulia. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, Thomas. And thanks, everybody, for listening and for your attention and questions.
And just to remind everybody again, we're back on Tuesday next week, and we hope to welcome you back then. And thank you very much for a fascinating talk and a great discussion. Thanks everybody for their questions. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.